everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Promise Perspective podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Green, and I'm excited to be here with you for another episode today. I am particularly excited for this episode because over the next few weeks, this study is the first of several that is going to take us into an in-depth study on several different words and concepts as they relate to shadows later fulfilled in our Messiah and how we live in the reality of those today. And I apologize, I am recovering from a head cold, so if I sound a little nasally, I apologize. But nonetheless, I still wanted to be here with you today, and I'm excited to do so. So let's get started. Much of modern theology today treats birthright and blessing as if they are interchangeable terms and ideas, different words, but for the same spiritual reality. But Scripture does not treat them that way. In Scripture, these concepts function as distinct covenantal roles, each with its own purpose, its own authority, and trajectory. And when tradition and doctrine collapses them into one category, so, like in other words, to essentially mean the same thing, even though they're two different words, it does more distortion to the gospel than bring it clarity. And my goal for today is that as we go over these terms and their purposes, you will see how they are shadows that ultimately point to Yahushua, our Messiah, as the one who receives both of these. So in the biblical narrative, birthright is a matter of inheritance and stewardship. It is legal. It is measurable. It's tied to land, lineage, and responsibility. Okay? Birthright is about position. Who is entrusted with stewardship over the Father's house? Who carries the name forward? That is birthright. Blessing, on the other hand, it's prophetic and it's covenantal. It carries authority, dominion, and the promise of rulership. And these two streams, birthright and blessing, often travel together, but we also see that these two are often separated, even within the same family. We see that they are assigned to different sons in different tribes, and Scripture goes out of its way to show us this distinction. And I believe that it's important that we pay attention. For example, Esau, he didn't lose salvation, quote unquote, lose salvation. He, as Scripture says, he despised his inheritance responsibility. We see Joseph. Joseph received the birthright, but he did not receive the throne. Judah received the scepter, the right to rule, but did not receive the double portion. That was Joseph's. And Scripture is explicit about this distinction long after the monarchy of Israel is established. So in this episode, we're going to really explore how those distinctions are shadows of our Messiah's kingly and priestly administration. Israel's story reveals a covenant order where inheritance, rulership, and priesthood are created and preserved until the one who could lawfully fulfill them all arrived. So Messiah does not erase Israel's inheritance. He does not redefine the promises. He does not spiritualize away the land, the people, the promises, right? Instead, he comes from Judah, and he qualifies as the rightful heir and the rightful king, and he unites birthright and blessing without collapsing their meanings. And he does this through a priesthood that is not bound to tribe or lineage, but it's tied to the order of Melchizedek. And he ministers through the order of Melchizedek because no single tribe could legally hold all three roles: inheritance, rulership, and priesthood, until he arrived. So I'm excited about this episode. We're going to slow down. We're really going to slow down and let scripture speak for itself. We are going to explore how those distinctions are shadows of our Messiah's kingly and priestly administration. So I want to trace how, there's a lot that I want to cover today. And I want to trace how birthright and blessing function in the Torah. I want to talk about how the prophets guard the separation of those terms. And I also want to talk about how Messiah fulfills both. Because when we are able to recover the biblical order of these things, we recover the coherence that is designed to build our faith and strengthen our faith in understanding just how our Messiah is revealed to us today, now that he has come through what is revealed in the scriptures. So I want to first begin this endeavor with understanding the terms for birthright and blessing. And the message that I really want to get across today is that our Messiah does not collapse the birthright and the blessing. We have to be able to see how they are distinct, yet how he inherits both and administers them through the Melchizedek priestly order. So in scripture, birthright and blessing are related, but they're not the same thing. They function as two distinct covenantal concepts that later tradition often merges, but the Bible itself keeps them meaningfully separate. And the story of Jacob and Esau is a prime example of this. So Genesis 27, verse 36, it says, "And Esau said, 'Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing.' And he said, 'Have you not reserved a blessing for me?'" So, like I just mentioned, Esau didn't technically lose anything, but this loss comes from the fact that he sold it because he despised his inheritance responsibility. For further references, see Genesis 25, verse 34, and Hebrews 12, verse 16. So notice how Esau said, "He took away my birthright." But Jacob didn't take it. Esau gave it up. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright." And Esau said, "Okay." The author of Hebrews shows us the distinction between the birthright and the blessing by using this very story. So Hebrews 12:16, Esau, for one morsel of food, sold his birthright. So Esau did not sell the blessing Isaac later pronounced in Genesis 27. And that's why, so he sold his birthright, but he did not sell the blessing, because Hebrews 12, verse 17 immediately clarifies. It says, "For afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected." So scripture treats these as two separate moments. Number one, birthright was sold earlier, Genesis 25. The blessing was sought later and it was lost, Genesis 27. So if birthright and blessing were the same thing, the author of Hebrews would not distinguish them. So what is the birthright? In scripture, the birthright is primarily a legal and physical inheritance that is tied to family order and household responsibility. Deuteronomy 21, verse 17, it says, "But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his." So the birthright included Number 1, a double portion of inheritance. Number 2, headship responsibility. The firstborn became steward of the family estate and the steward of the welfare of the household. And number 3, continuity of the family line. So the birthright preserved the physical lineage, land, and the name. So in short, the birthright included an inheritance, land, multiplication, and family headship. The main function of the birthright had to do with who inherits property and who has authority of the father's house and carries the family name. And the birthright was reserved for the firstborn. In fact, the word for birthright in Hebrew is bekorah, and the Hebrew word for firstborn is the root of that very word, which is bekor. So even the Hebrew language intrinsically ties them together. However, as we saw with Esau, the birthright is something that can be forfeited. And we also see this in the case with Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn son of Jacob and Leah, Genesis 49:3. But he ultimately did not get the birthright. Why is that? It's recorded in Genesis 35, verse 22, that he defiled his father's, Jacob's bed. And this is what is referenced in 1 Chronicles 5, verses 1 through 2. It says, "Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was indeed the firstborn. But because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's." So due to sin, Reuben's birthright, the physical firstborn, it was given to Joseph, who was Jacob's 11th son. However, what we see in Genesis 48 is that the birthright is actually extended to Joseph's son, Ephraim. Genesis 48, verse 5, and it says, "And now your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simon, they shall be mine." So Ephraim and Manasseh are adopted as Jacob's own sons, and the birthright is extended to Joseph's son, Ephraim. Jacob places his right hand on Ephraim because Ephraim wasn't the firstborn between him and Manasseh. And so when Jacob put his right hand on Ephraim, Ephraim literally became Jacob's son. Jacob adopted both of them so that they would legally be his sons and not grandsons. He said, "Just as Reuben and Simon are his sons, they shall be my sons." They were no longer his grandsons. They were adopted as his sons. Once that happened, Jacob then possessed the legal right to give Ephraim the firstborn birthright. And Yahuwah later confirms this legal adoption, recorded in Jeremiah 31, verse 9. It says, "For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn." But the thing is, like I said, Ephraim wasn't the physical firstborn. Like I said, he wasn't even a son of Jacob until he was adopted. This is where we have to understand that although birthright is assigned by the order of birth in a family line, it is ultimately governed by Yah's sovereign purpose. It's not about being first. It's about being fit to carry what that responsibility requires. This is why we see that although Reuben was the physical firstborn, he failed to meet that responsibility because he defiled his father's bed. So while the birthright is reserved for the firstborn in Scripture, we constantly see this line of shifting of the birthright that was done by the Most High. And in Genesis In Genesis alone, there's at least 4 cases of this. We see from Esau to Jacob, from Zerah to Pharez, from Reuben to Joseph, and from Manasseh to Ephraim. And this shifting of birthright is revealed in the second writings as a matter of predestination and is not something based on man's doing or something dependent on us physically, like our natural birth or lineage. Ephesians 1 verse 5, it says, having predestined us to adoption as sons by Yahushua Messiah to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. Ephesians 1 verse 11, in him also we have obtained an inheritance, being predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. And earlier in verse 9 in Ephesians, Paul refers to this will as a mystery. 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 19 and 20 says, but with the precious blood of Messiah, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. So I don't want to get ahead of myself because the topic of firstborn is something that we are actually going to cover in episode 18, Yah willing. So to be continued. So let's go back to Genesis and let's turn our attention to Genesis 49. So Genesis 49 is Jacob's blessing on the children of Israel before he passes away. Many of these blessings are prophetic to our Messiah. And first, I want to start with Joseph, and then I want to talk about Judah, because the birthright has to do with Ephraim, Joseph's son. Well, technically now it's Jacob's son. But the blessing has to do with Judah. We just haven't gotten that far yet. So as some of you probably already know, Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. Yet Joseph redeemed his entire family when he was made a ruler in Egypt. So by reading Genesis 49 verses 22 through 26, we can see that in hindsight now, but we have a responsibility now to be able to read scripture in foresight. And we're given the ability to be able to study and search these things, these shadows of our Messiah out in the scriptures. So that is what we're going to be doing with Joseph. So let's read this passage first. Genesis 49 verses 22 through 26. It says, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him and hated him, but his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. So part of the blessing on Ephraim, who by Jacob's blessing is now made the firstborn of Israel, is that he would become a multitude of nations. That word in Ephraim, that the word Ephraim in Hebrew means doubly fruitful. The core of Ephraim's prophetic blessing is that he would be fruitful. I quote, a fruitful bough. His branches run over the wall. Blessings abound. So we're reading about branches crossing boundaries. So an inheritance extending beyond natural borders. So this is expansion language. And in verse 23, we see the archer's language pointing towards suffering, right? Now, the crucial prophetic turn is in verses 23 and 24, where it says, the archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. So Joseph's life pattern was this: rejected by his brothers, betrayed for silver, which he was betrayed for 20 shekels, which was the price for a young slave, Leviticus 27:5. Joseph suffered unjustly, later exalted to preserve the life of others. And so this is typology. It's not coincidence. And our Messiah follows the same pattern. Rejected by his brothers, sold, handed over. He was also sold for silver. He was sold for 30 shekels. That was slave compensation according to Exodus 21, verse 32. He suffered unjustly, and he was exalted to bring life to many. And in verse 24, we see part of it says this. It says, from there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now, because this phrase is in parentheses in many translations, many automatically assume that it wasn't originally part of the text. But that's not true. This phrase is consistently preserved across ancient manuscripts. But the reason it's in parentheses is because it's debated how that text is to be understood. In the Hebrew text, it reads, from their shepherd stone Israel. But what does that mean? So people put it in parentheses because it's how translators are trying to connect the words. So just for clarity, the parentheses here in that verse, it indicates that there have been words added in order to make sense of the syntax and the structure of the sentence. Okay, so the parentheses is not that it was added, it's preserving the integrity of the text. Because there, like I said, there have been words added to it to make sense of the sentence structure. So that's a good thing. That's what the parentheses is signifying to the reader, to us today. So verse 24 is a pivotal verse because Jacob suddenly shifts from Joseph as the man to Joseph as the quote unquote type. Shepherd and stone are messianic titles all throughout Scripture. Here's some examples. Psalm 23, Psalm 118, verse 22, where it says, that's that famous verse, the stone which the builders refused has become the head of the corner. That Hebrew word for head is the same Hebrew word used when Jacob says that the blessings of your father will be on the head of Joseph. Psalm 60, verse 7 and Psalm 108, verse 8 says that Ephraim is the strength of my head. You can also read Isaiah 28:16, Zechariah 3, verse 9, and Daniel 2, verses 34 and 35. So Jacob is not foreshadowing that Joseph is Messiah. This is prophetic in that Joseph's role points to him. The birthright of Joseph is a shadow that reveals to us that this shadow is ultimately fulfilled in Yahusha. He is the substance of what this shadow is pointing toward. In verse 26, we read, and this is an important detail, in Genesis 49, where it says that we see Joseph being crowned as the heir, not the king, the heir. We see the double portion, the land inheritance, the expansion, the prophetic blessings of Joseph reveal that he is the heir of the inheritance. Again, a shadow that is fulfilled in Messiah. Joseph's blessing points forward to Messiah as the rejected one who preserves life, the firstborn heir whose inheritance expands beyond natural borders, the shepherd in the stone who emerges through suffering. And Yahusha does not redefine Joseph's role, right? He fulfills it. Ephraim/Joseph is the head. He carries the birthright. So this is revealing a pattern, okay? Joseph carries the birthright, and that birthright functions as a prophetic shadow pointing forward to the one who would inherit it in full. In Genesis 49, Joseph is crowned. Again, he's not crowned as king, he's heir. The language is very clear. Abundance, fruitfulness, expansion, inheritance, reaching beyond borders. The blessings on the head of Joseph would later be fulfilled in Messiah. Colossians chapter 1 verse 18 says, "And he is the head of the body, the assembly, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence." That word preeminence in Greek means to hold the first place in rank or influence. It's actually the only verse in the New Testament that this word is used, but this will become more significant when we move on to the topic of the firstborn. We'll move on in that discussion. So Joseph's life and blessing established the biblical meaning of the birthright, the right to inherit, to preserve life, the name, family responsibility, to steward abundance for the sake of others, rejected by his brothers, humbled through suffering, and later exalted to sustain what would become both Israel and the nations. Joseph becomes a living testimony of how inheritance operates before rulership ever appears. And that testimony does not end with him either. Messiah fulfills this shadow lawfully and completely, declared the firstborn, appointed heir of all things, and proven faithful through suffering. Yahushua receives this inheritance. So what Joseph held in part, Messiah inherits in fullness. The branches that prophetically crossed walls now extends to the ends of the earth, anchoring the inheritance in the one to whom it always belonged. Whatever Joseph stewarded temporarily, Messiah administers eternally. This is one of the many reasons Paul says in Galatians 3:29 that if you are Messiah's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. This is why Paul says in Romans 8 verse 17 that, and if children, then heirs, heirs of Elohim and joint heirs with Messiah, if indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. This has everything, and I mean everything, to do with understanding the birthright. It's a responsibility, but it also comes with promises. I've heard many people say things to the brethren like, you don't receive the promises if you're not the bloodline descendants. And when I hear things like that, I am just so saddened, not because it offends me, but because it shows me that people who say things like that have a huge misunderstanding of the accomplishments of Messiah's works. It makes me the most sad when I hear things like that, because it actually reveals that they haven't fully grasped what the promises actually are, what they mean. And it truly exposes how shallow their grasp of covenant really is. And it just makes me so sad, because there are people like that are unintentionally doing the same thing many in Scripture did, trying to secure something through natural identity that the Most High has always shown must be secured through covenant faithfulness. And covenant faithfulness is perfectly embodied in Yahushua our Messiah. And that does not mean that anything is erased or replaced. It's about entering and grasping and embracing the fulfillment of it the way the Most High always intended. The birthright fulfilled in Messiah, that does not terminate in a lineage. It was meant to be fulfilled in a person. And this is like why I have said multiple times on social media, on my podcast, that we have got to wrestle with the scriptures the way that the early apostles did, because that is the only way that they could prove that Yahushua was the Messiah, with the scriptures, with the Old Testament, not some ecumenical creed, not some spiritualization of what things mean, real tangible scripture that proved that he was who he said he was, that he was the promised son, that he was the promised Messiah, was and is, right? And this is why I take this podcast season so seriously, and this is why these topics are so dear to my heart, because that's how they understood Messiah, with wrestling through the scriptures. And it was a really humbling moment for me when I was like, one day I just was kind of like, why am I not doing that? Why do I not know that? How do I not know these things? So that's how I got to where I am currently, So yeah, I mean, so now through him, these promises, this inheritance, it becomes something that you and I are invited to inherit by being joined to the one who already holds it. It's his inheritance. And that's why Paul said we are co-heirs. If you are in Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed according to the promise. So if you are children of the Most High, if you are children of the promise, then you are co-heirs with Messiah. And that's why you got to understand what the birthright means. We have to understand that the birthright is not only about firstborn status, it's about predetermined, status. Because like I said, birthright isn't reserved for a physical lineage. And we've already gone over the examples of how that's illustrated. I mean, it's just such a beautiful truth, and that's why this matters so much. Because if we misunderstand the birthright through Messiah, we will either always try to be earning something by our own might, or we will try to exclude those who the Father's calling in. The birthright has always been about the faithful son, and we must learn how to read the Old Testament through that lens now. We read the we read the Bible in hindsight now. It was written with a Messiah in foresight. Now we have to be able to read it in hindsight, because that's the Son has come and accomplished what he was sent to accomplish. And now we get the privilege and opportunity to search him out in the scriptures that were always pointing to him. Joseph shows us what the birthright is. Messiah reveals who it was for. And you have to understand his inheritance in order to understand your inheritance because of him. The birthright is given to the firstborn, which cannot be any more clear that the firstborn is Messiah. And in him, you also receive that inheritance. But this requires more than just belief alone. It requires an understanding of what the Father's covenant is, that you are either being grafted back into as a natural branch or being grafted into as a wild branch for the first time. Understanding the birthright given to Joseph, fulfilled in Messiah, allows you to see that this does not replace Israel. It reveals the expansion of what Yahushua was prophesied to do through the blessing upon Ephraim, okay? Because that is who the birthright was for. Remember, okay? There's a very deep connection prophetically about the blessing that was given to Ephraim as the firstborn. Because again, Ephraim was not a grandson of Jacob. He was adopted legally as his son. So, fruitfulness, when you're in the context of Ephraim, which means doubly fruitful, fruitfulness equals expansion, equals whose branches run over the wall, signifying territorial expansion beyond the borders. And who are the branches? natural and wild branches. People are branches, right? If you've listened to episode 14, you know what I'm talking about here. He is the vine, we are the branches, right? Whose branches run over the wall? Territorial expansion beyond the borders, the grafting in of the nations. The prophecy of Ephraim is that his seed would become a multitude of nations. I mean, it's mind-blowing to me that this is something, until I actually started studying it myself, I had never heard this talked about. I've never heard a sermon about this. And I'm over here like, mind blown. And we're not even halfway done yet. But so yeah, Messiah fulfills the birthright, right? We've been talking about this. He restores a scattered Israel. Matthew 10, verse 6. He reclaims a lost inheritance due to covenant unfaithfulness. He expands the covenant family. John 10:16. And a few more verses that nail down inheritance through birthright is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2. It says he's appointed heir of all things. Romans 8, verse 29. The firstborn among many brethren. Matthew 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So we see the birthright was given to Ephraim through Joseph, through adoption. Ephraim is not biologically firstborn, yet Yahuwah applies birthright language to him. But who's the blessing given to? And what is the significance and distinction between the birthright and the blessing? So we've covered how Messiah fulfills the birthright, okay? So moving on to blessing. It's clear that the birthright, it doesn't have anything to do with kingship or throne. The double portion of the birthright refers to land and people. In Scripture, the birthright has to do with inheritance, while the blessing has to do with rulership, spiritual authority, covenant governance. These are very important distinctions that we must make because these are two different and important covenantal roles. That's why I said in the beginning, you can't combine these terms or use them synonymously, because our Messiah distinctly fulfilled both of these without flattening the two terms together and without one replacing the other or making them synonymous with one another. They're related, but they're not the same thing. So it's important to break these down because it helps us, in my opinion, it helps us understand the gospel so much better. And in order to understand this blessing, guess what we got to do? We got to go back to Abraham, because before there were the 12 tribes of Israel, we know that the Most High first gave this promised blessing to Abraham. And this is why I placed these episodes in a very specific order, because the blessing and promise given to Abraham is quite literally the foundation of our faith, the foundation of the gospel. It is the gospel because the seed of the promise is Yahusha. So I can't revisit it all here, but if you haven't listened to episode 8, I encourage you to do so because it will bring more clarity to this particular episode. So Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3 says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And then Genesis 17, verse 7, it says, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in their generations for an everlasting covenant to be Elohim to you and your descendants after you. So you can then track this promised blessing down to Isaac, Jacob, which his name eventually was changed to Israel. And then where does it eventually lead to? It goes to King David, who was a descendant of the tribe of Judah. We've tracked these different covenants and we've tracked these throughout episodes 4 through 12 on this podcast season. We've talked about unconditional covenants as well as conditional covenants. We did a brief study in episode 7 on King David, in which Yahuwah swore an unconditional covenant to David regarding his seed. So this is what scripture says. It says 2 Samuel, we're going to read 7 verses 12 through 14 and verse 16. It says, when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. Psalm 89 verses 3 and 4. It says, I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to my servant David. Your seed I will establish forever and build up your throne to all generations. Selah. Psalm 89 verse 19 and 20. It says, then you spoke in a vision to your Holy One and said, I have given help to one who is mighty. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found my servant David. With my holy oil I have anointed him. Psalm 89 verses 27 through 29. It says, also I will make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. My mercy I will keep for him forever, and my covenant shall stand firm with him. His seed also I will make to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. I'm not done. Psalm 89 verse 36 and 37. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, even like the faithful witness in the sky. Selah. Psalm 132 verses 10 and 11. For your servant David's sake, for your servant David's sake, do not turn away the face of your anointed. Yahuwah has sworn in truth to David. He will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. And this particular psalm is quoted in Acts chapter 2, verse 30. It says, therefore, being a prophet and knowing that God had sworn an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Messiah to sit on his throne. So much covenant language regarding David and his seed. This particular seed was going to build the throne and it would be established forever. This particular seed was going to inherit the Father's kingdom. This particular seed was going to be made the firstborn. And this particular seed was going to come from Judah. So, why is this significant? Because we must understand now what seed is being talked about when we read the Tanakh, when we read prophecies in the Old Testament. Because the authors of the New Testament letters continuously point us back to Genesis and the writings in the Tanakh by connecting the chosen seed of Abraham to our Messiah. Galatians 3 verses 14 and 16, that the blessing of Abraham might come upon the nations in Messiah Yahusha, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Another really important term that needs to be clarified is this term, children of the promise. So children of the promise is a tightly defined scriptural category. It's not some vague spiritual phrase to claim casually. It's constantly being defined as being children of Abraham through faith in Messiah. Paul says this in Galatians 3, verse 7 and 8. Therefore know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. In the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the nations by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. And guess what verse Paul is quoting here? Genesis 12:3, pointing us back to the blessings promised to Abraham. And this is the same lesson he's teaching in Romans 4, verses 13 through 16. It It says, for the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise made of no effect, because the law brings about wrath, for that where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be according to grace, so that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who was the father of us all. Same thing in Romans 9, verses 6 through 8. It says, but it is not that the word of Elohim has taken no effect, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel, nor are they all children because they are the seed of Abraham. But in Isaac your seed shall be called. He's quoting Genesis 21, verse 12 there. That is, those who are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of Elohim, but the children of the promise are counted as the seed. And then Galatians 3:29 again, if you are Messiah's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And the author of Hebrews confirms this with the utmost clarity. It says in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 14 and verse 17, it says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply you. He's literally quoting the reaffirmation of the promise given to Abraham. Thus, God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. So the promise produces heirs, not simply just believers, not just tag along citizens of Israel. Messiah, so Romans 4 verse 13, it says the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So Messiah fulfills this as heir, not by canceling it. Messiah confirms and fulfills the promise. Because again, he is the seed prophetically that the promises have always been pointing to. And that's why to be in him, to be grafted into him is how you receive the promise. That's why Paul's like, it's not by the law. It's not by the flesh. You have to be in Messiah. This is about understanding covenant. Hebrews 9 verse 15, and for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. So, children of the promise are those counted as the seed of Abraham through Messiah, those who inherit by promise and by faith, not flesh alone, and those who are joined to the firstborn heir of all things. This promise never changed. The heir was always the goal. This is the covenant logic that Scripture uses from Genesis to the revelation of Messiah. And the authors of the New Testament writings know exactly what they're talking about when making these connections. This is why when we read Scripture, when it comes to understanding the promises to the quote-unquote seed, you have to be able to put on the mind of Messiah and read the Old Testament with the lens of the revelation of him, or else you're going to miss a lot. For example, in the context of blessing, Isaiah 65 verse 9 says that I will bring forth a seed out of Jacob, out of Judah, an inheritor of my mountains, and my elect shall inherit it, and my servants shall dwell there. The seed out of Judah, who is the inheritor, is Yahusha. So then when it says later in verse 17 of that same chapter, we can understand the context is regarding the end time / new beginnings, because it's saying, behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. And then it goes on to say in verse 23 that regarding my people, that they are the seed of the blessed of Yahuwah. So if the seed is Messiah, and the seed is the one who is promised the blessings of Abraham, and if those in Messiah are also considered Abraham's seed and heirs of the promise, then this seed being talked about in Isaiah 65 is referencing a restoration, and what defines what that seed is. Who is that seed? The restoration that involves a whole house of natural and grafted in branches of Israel. Again, we have to read the Old Testament prophecies through the lens of Yahusha. We aren't reading it in foresight anymore. He already came. We're reading it in hindsight now. And that is so key. So now that we know that the blessing is to the seed of Abraham, which is Messiah now, it should be very clear also that grafting in does not mean replacement, and inclusion does not mean dispossession or erasure of a lineage. However, I think now would be a good time to revisit a topic mentioned previously about this concept of being born again. So John chapter 3 verse 3 and 3 verse 7 talks about how Yahusha says you have to be born again. Unless one is born again, you cannot see the kingdom of Elohim. And the Greek word for again is anothein, and it does not mean again. It means from above, from a higher place, from the beginning. That word is used 13 times in the New Testament scriptures. And 13 times, John 3 verse 3 and John 3 verse 7 are the only times it is translated in English to the word again. Like, why not just be consistent with the translations? But because our Messiah, it actually makes so much more sense what he's saying when he says, you have to be born from above in order to see the kingdom of Yahuwah. He's explained that word, that statement is summarizing everything that has been discussed so far on this particular episode. It's a paradigm shift when it's translated appropriately. We aren't called to be born again. We're called to be a part of the assembly of the firstborn, which is registered in heaven. Those born from above are the firstborn assembly. And that is not tied to a bloodline. There's a much bigger plan of redemption of Yahuwah that we have to get out of our flesh in order to see. That's why Yahusha's statements are so significant, because inheritance has everything to do with being predestined or foreordained by the Most High. It says he chose us before the foundation of the world. Ephesians 1 verse 4. 1 Peter 1 verse 20 says that he, Yahusha, indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. Now, this goes beyond the scope of this particular episode, but I believe the reason that we get confused is because we think that Yahusha being the firstborn of creation has to do with being physically created before the world was created. But I don't believe that's accurate. He was foreordained, but I don't believe he was pre-existent. In order to fulfill prophecy, it says, we already read these verses, he had to physically come from the loins of David. That's who he had to come in the flesh. Psalm 132:11 and Acts 2 verse 30 confirms it. And it says according to the flesh, like he had to come in the flesh. That's one of the biggest reasons I don't believe he was pre-existent. In the minds and plans of the Most High, absolutely. But that's just where I stand on it currently. He is the preeminent firstborn. It says Colossians 1 verse 18 says that he's the head of the assembly who is the beginning, the assembly of the firstborn written in heaven, those who are born from above, and that Yahusha is the firstborn of the dead. He is the preeminent firstborn because he is the firstborn of the new creation. He was foreordained before the foundation of the world, just like those who are registered in the Jerusalem from above are. But as we've covered, to be firstborn isn't necessarily about, it doesn't require you to be the firstborn physically. To be the firstborn in the assembly, the firstborn assembly of heaven, it doesn't require you to be born physically first. It requires you to be preordained. And it says, to be the firstborn, it's not about chronological order, but as we've covered, it's about the firstborn in preeminence and rank. Hebrews 12 verses 22 through 24, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly, an assembly of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Yahusha, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Galatians 4 verse 26 says, but the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. I mean, there's just so much that can be said about who the seed of Israel truly is, right? So many people want to accuse others of replacement theology, when in reality, it is the fulfillment of covenant, inheritance, and expansion that is recorded all throughout Scripture. We must have eyes to see how Messiah is so infiltrated in the Old Testament writings that if we aren't able to read the Old Testament now with that revelation of his coming, we won't be able to grasp the fullness of the gospel. Understanding this topic of the blessing and how it's fulfilled in Messiah it's actually a lot deeper than I originally thought. It's a deep topic to sift through. And we haven't even really gotten into it all just yet. But I want to talk more about Jacob's blessings in Genesis 49. We already talked about one aspect of this in my True Vine episode, the last episode. So if you haven't listened to that, I encourage you to do so. Because last time we focused on Genesis 49:11, but today I want to focus on Genesis 49 verses 8 through 10. We didn't get there last time. So let's read the passage first. It says, Genesis 49 verses 8 through 10. It says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down. He lies down as a lion. And as a lion, who shall rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. So the word obedience in Hebrew means gathering, cleansing, or purging. But the root of that word means submission. Now I've got to read you the Septuagint translation because it reads completely different than the modern English translations. It still carries the same meaning and significance. I just think it's interesting how differently it reads. It says, a ruler shall not fail from Judah, nor a prince from his loins, until there come the things stored up for him, and he is the expectation of nations. So Judah explicitly receives the blessings of rulership, spiritual authority, covenant governance, as we've seen clearly with King David, right? Judah receives no mention of birthright here, only rule, okay? Earlier in Genesis 27:29, Isaac previously says to Jacob, let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren. Jacob then later passes this blessing on to his son Judah. This blessing is ultimately determined the messianic line and covenant leadership. So now I want to remind you again that the blessing and the birthright are still being separated here. And you can lose the birthright. We already talked about Reuben and 1 Chronicles 5 verse 2, where it says, though Judah prevailed over his brothers and from him came the ruler, the birthright belonged to Joseph. So clear distinction here. Okay. You can lose your birthright. Blessings, though, are binding. Blessings are prophetic. They are irrevocable. But that's why I'm trying to make this distinction between the two, because although Israel and Judah broke covenant with Yahuwah, the blessing upon the line of Judah could not be changed. There was a promise. Remember, there was a promise made to Abraham. It was an unconditional covenant that Yahuwah swore to no one higher than himself, according to Hebrews chapter 6. So Yah cannot break his word. Okay, we're tying all of this together. There was a promise made to Abraham. This blessing was confirmed through Judah and later through King David, who obviously confirms the messianic line. This is why scripture is so powerful, because again, Yahuwah's word cannot be broken. But this phrase, until Shiloh comes, that indicates an impending change worth paying attention to. Because you know how people say, Yahuwah does not change. No, he does not. But if he tells us there's going to be a change and we don't pay attention to it, we might get confused. Okay? So, who is Shiloh? Well, according to the text, Shiloh is identified as a person. Until Shiloh comes, and unto him shall the obedience or the gathering of the people be. So, based on so many other texts, even Revelation itself identifies Messiah as the Lion from the tribe of Judah, right? We know that this passage of verses is explicitly foreshadowing our coming Messiah. Okay, so this is going to get a little tedious, so bear with me here. But Shiloh in Hebrew is referred to based on two different Strong's Concordance numbers. You have Strong's H7886 and 7887. These are the same word, even the same vowel points, just placed in the dictionary under two different numbers. Shiloh in Hebrew means tranquility or place of rest. Several scriptures in the New Testament speak on this impending change that I will mention here, but we will get deeper into later in this season where we start talking about shadows of the priesthood, okay? But I just want to plant this seed for now. Acts chapter 3, verse 20 and 21 says that, and that he may send Yahushua Messiah, who was preached to you before, whom heaven must receive until the times of restoration of all things, which Elohim has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began. So Peter is literally saying that Yahushua has already been preached to you through the prophets. And then he goes on to quote Deuteronomy 18, verse 15 and Acts 3, verse 22. And then Peter goes on to quote in verse 25 of Acts chapter 3, Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3 again. So the theme is recurrent in pointing us back to the Torah, back to Abraham, okay? The writers of the New Testament letters are always pointing back to Abraham for good reason. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 10, this is referring to the first tabernacle and priestly services. It says, concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So, this is referring to a change in the priesthood. There were ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So, until Shiloh comes is in Genesis is indicating that there is an impending change prophesied about how someone would come in which there would be a change in the Torah. He said he didn't come to abolish, but to fulfill, right? Well, to fulfill, it still means that there is a change that needs to be made in the administration of it. The change in Torah is in the way it is administered under a different priesthood. Makes sense how Paul can say the law is spiritual, okay? This is how we can say that something changes without saying the law is abolished, okay? And we can speak that confidently without speaking against the Torah while still upholding the Torah, even though there are certain things we don't physically do anymore. A lot of people don't understand that because too many of us, this was myself too until I really started thinking about what that means, too many of us say, keep the commandments, keep the commandments, keep the commandments, without explaining what exactly has been fulfilled, and exactly what has been changed. Most people explain it as, oh, it's just all the same thing according to the letter, except this time we just do it in a more sincere way from the heart. And, it's just confusing. That's very confusing, which is why I've been trying to be very, very intentional in my own studies to determine, okay, what exactly has changed? How do I speak on that without speaking against what is already written? And that's when the Ruach led me to understand that it has everything to do with the administration of Torah under the Melchizedek priestly order. Yahuwah renewed the covenant through Yahusha to bring us back to his original plan. There is not a change that has gone unprophesied about. Yahusha came to call us back to the Melchizedek order, which was established before the Levitical order. Back to the Melchizedek priesthood, which was established before the Levitical priesthood. And back to the covenant of promise and inheritance given to Abraham before he even knew a Levite, in which was a promise that all the families, nations of the earth would be blessed. Yahusha truly is the beginning and the end. And this is the time of Reformation. We've been living in the time of Reformation. And Yahuwah is calling us through his son. He's calling us out of the shadows to live in the reality of what these shadows have always pointed to. His son. Shiloh has come. The seed in which the promises have always pointed to has come. And now Messiah has received the inheritance of the promise. He's received the inheritance of the firstborn and the blessing, the right to rule as king. And he's inherited and the change in administration of the priesthood has been done through him. It's like seeing this fulfillment does change the way that we apply Torah to our lives today. Because again, like Paul said, the law is spiritual. And what's interesting is that Shiloh was also a place. While Shiloh means tranquility, peace, and rest, it was also a city in Ephraim. And it was the temporary home of the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. Judges 21:19, it stayed in Shiloh for a long time. Joshua and Samuel both came from the tribe of Ephraim and is where Samuel grew up. Before Israel was divided into two kingdoms, before they were divided, the monarchy was divided, Shiloh was where the tabernacle was put, and it's where the land was subdued. Joshua 18:1, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there, and the land was subdued before them. Joshua 18 verses 8 through 10, and the men arose and went away. And Joshua charged them that went to describe the land, saying, go and walk through the land and describe it, and come again to me, that I may here cast lots for you before Yahuwah in Shiloh. And the men went and passed through the land, and described it by cities into 7 parts in a book, and came again to Joshua to the host at Shiloh. And Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before Yahuwah. And there Joshua divided the land unto the children of Israel according to their divisions. But here's the thing. Yahuwah removed his tabernacle from Shiloh, physically and prophetically. And this is a very significant detail, and it matters prophetically because Shiloh is the one who will, so again, like I said, it's a person and a place. Shiloh is the one who will unite the sticks of Ephraim, Israel, and Judah when he returns. So for several centuries in Israel's early history, the ark is at Shiloh, the priesthood functions there, national leadership operates from there, Samuel ministers there. So, but this makes Ephraim the center of worship, inheritance, administration, covenant life during the judges period. Jeremiah tells us in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 12, that it says, "Go now to my place which was in Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it." Right? So it says Yahuwah placed his name first at Shiloh, which was, again, in Ephraim. But later on, we know that later scripture explicitly says, 2 Chronicles 6, verse 6, it says, "I've chosen Jerusalem, that my name may be there, and have chosen David to be over my people Israel." So Jerusalem is often referred to as the city of David, which was a city in Judah. David was appointed by Yah to be ruler over Israel and Judah. So was his son Solomon. That's 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 34 and 35. And when our Messiah returns, the same will be so. Psalm 132, verses 13 through 14, it says, "I have chosen Zion. This is my resting place forever." This transition of where the Most High chooses to place his name is captured in Psalm 78. Psalm 78 is a historical psalm rehearsing, or summarizing Israel's repeated rebellion. But the turning point comes in verse 60. So Psalm 68, verse 60, it says, "So that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand." So he's talking about Ephraim here. Ephraim is the strength of my head, is a phrase repeated in Psalm 60, verse 7, and Psalm 108, verse 8. It says, "He forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh." And that statement is not something to take lightly. To forsake means to cast off, cast away, send away, reject, abandon. Forsake is a very strong word in Hebrew. In verse 67 of Psalm 78, it goes on to say that he refused the tabernacle of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim. And then what does he say? Psalm 78, verse 68 through 70 says, "But he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has established forever. He also chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds." So Psalm 78, verse 69 sits right at the theological hinge of the psalm. So to understand it, you have to read it in context, especially in light of Shiloh, Ephraim, Zion, and David. So let me read it again. Psalm 78, verse 69, it says, "And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which he has founded forever." Verse 69 explains what kind of sanctuary Zion would be in contrast to Shiloh. It says he built his sanctuary. This sanctuary at Shiloh in Ephraim, it was a tent or a tabernacle. It was mobile. They followed the cloud by day and fire by night. It was conditional in function. But at Zion, though, the sanctuary is built like the heights. At Zion, it is built, fixed, and established forever. This is only talking about an earthly sanctuary as a shadow to the heavenly Jerusalem. So in Hebrew poetry, when it says like the heights, it's an exaltation of authority. It's not a geographical phrase. This is not normal temple description language. No earthly sanctuary is like the heights, heavenly realm, or founded forever like the earth itself. So this sanctuary at Zion is being elevated in covenant role and centralized under kingship. It says this sanctuary is like the earth which he has established forever. This is like divine establishment. Shiloh is removed, Zion is founded forever. And so for Psalm 78, verse 67, to say that he chose not the tribe of Ephraim, it does not mean that he rejects Ephraim's existence or that the birthright is revoked. Psalm 78 is all about Yah shifting from a provisional dwelling at Shiloh to an established kingship in Zion. It's a shift in covenant administration, and it's a transferring of the location of where he chose to place his name. This transition doesn't cancel birthright. It reorders covenant roles to point forward to Messiah. Until Shiloh comes is less about geography and more about identity. This is why we see Zion referred to as both a physical, geographical location, but also a heavenly dwelling place. It's like even Zion was physical, but it's also a shadow of a heavenly and a greater reality. So Psalm 78, verse 69, it points beyond an earthly structure to an eternal sanctuary. So, in other words, when he says that he has forsook the tabernacle at Shiloh, it's like I said, it's not saying that he does away with all these things. It's saying that he's pointing us to something greater. So this eternal sanctuary where Yah's presence and authority are no longer temporary. So what was divided between Ephraim and Judah, what was divided between birthright and the blessing and the kingship, the fulfillment, it's ultimately unified in Messiah. So what we are seeing in Psalm 78 is we're going through the history of Israel, and the end, hold on a second. Blah, blah, blah. So what we are seeing in Psalm 78 is we're going through the history of Israel, and the end of Psalm 78 is telling us the result of this history. So there's a realignment happening here, the reordering of roles, which again does not equal loss of inheritance. We see the elevation of Judah for a specific purpose, and we see a pattern of dwelling places pointing to something eternal. And our Messiah fulfills this pattern by, he comes from Judah, a prophesied king from the loins of David, establishing a greater temple, right? Not made with human hands, John 2:19 through 21, and Hebrews 8, verse 2. And also by uniting presence and kingship permanently and eternally. So Zion is a real place, but Zion is also patterned after something greater. So it's almost like for this particular podcast episode, there's many shadows to consider. How everything finds its fulfillment in Messiah, how it points to Messiah. Shiloh foreshadowed this presence. Zion establishes kingship, and Messiah secures both forever and ever. And we know Psalm 78, verse 69 is pointing toward an eternal reality in Yahusha, because David's tabernacle, though established by Yahuwah, it did in fact fall. This is why the prophet Amos speaks of the restoration of the fallen tabernacle of David. What began in Shiloh and was established in Zion is ultimately completed in our Messiah, where Yah's dwelling is officially unified. Until Shiloh come, and unto him shall be the gathering of the people. You picking up what the Ruach is putting down here? So Amos chapter 9, verse 11, it says, "In that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen, and repair its breaches. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old." The restoration Amos is speaking of is Messiah. Psalm 78:69 declares that the Most High transitioned from a conditional, movable sanctuary at Shiloh to a permanent, exalted, king-centered sanctuary at Zion, which was physical, again, but was also pointing to something greater, something heavenly, something eternal. And in doing so, it grounding his dwelling place in an everlasting covenant that ultimately finds its fulfillment in Messiah. And it's just amazing how one verse can reveal so much. There's probably still so much to be understood about the topic of Shiloh and Zion and how they're connected, how they build on progression, and how they're fulfilled in Messiah. It's amazing how one verse can reveal so much, and how, there has to be precepts and a foundation built before we can even understand the significance of exactly what it is Yahusha is coming to restore. Amos 9, verse 11, and the remaining verses is exactly what Peter called out and quoted to the Pharisees and leaders in Acts chapter 15, verses 14 through 18, when he points them to Amos's prophecy, after saying that it will be Israel and those of the nations who Yahuwah calls that will be the ones to build up the tabernacle of David. So when you read the prophecy in Amos chapter 9 of this great restoration, again, just like many other things, you have to make sure you're reading it through the right lens. The prophet Zechariah also speaks to this rebuilding and restoring. Zechariah 6, verse 12 and 13. "Then speak to him, saying, Thus says Yahuwah of hosts, saying, Behold, the man whose name is the branch. From his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of Yahuwah. Yes, he shall build the temple of Yahuwah. He shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule on his throne. So he shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both." So, hello, Messiah. The tabernacle of David was fallen. Yahuwah cast Israel and Judah out of his sight. Please go read Jeremiah 7, verses 12 through 15. Yet he did not leave them without hope and a promise of restoration. Yahusha is the only one able to unite Ephraim and Judah back together. And it's really important that you and I know how that was fulfilled, and how we apply these promises to our lives and our walk today. So biblically, just to kind of wrap everything up, Shiloh is the first place of covenant dwelling and name bearing, located in Ephraim, and Jerusalem is the chosen place of permanent royal administration, located in Judah. Messiah is the fulfillment of the birthright and the blessing and the priesthood, in which under the Melchizedek administration and order as priest and king, he is the only one capable of uniting Israel, aka Ephraim, and Judah as one house like before. And this, when he returns, includes all those grafted in under this administration. This will hopefully make more sense when we discuss in detail the shadow that explains the nations through Ephraim's adoption. That will be in the next episode, y'all willing. Messiah fulfills this blessing given to Judah. He comes from Judah, receives David's throne, and rules from Zion. That's why we went over Psalm 78, because we're talking about a person as well as a place, right? So this is the blessing fulfilled. Judah's leadership foreshadows Messiah's kingship and covenant administration. Joseph's birthright, aka Ephraim's birthright, foreshadows the inheritance and the name. Remember, the birthright is the one responsible for carrying the family name and inheritance. Okay? We aren't getting into the mechanics of the priesthood just yet because that's a huge topic in and of itself. But this administration that we're talking about, Melchizedek, it requires an order that is higher than all of the tribes. The problem that the law, the Torah in and of itself cannot solve is that no single tribe can lawfully hold the authority of all three offices. Birthright belongs to Joseph, Ephraim. I use them both because I don't want to separate them. But kingship belongs to Judah. Priesthood belongs to Levi. And this is very intentional. Hebrews 7:11, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, then what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? So the resolve, the answer, because not one single tribe cannot lawfully hold the offices of birthright, blessing, and priesthood, birthright meaning inheritance, blessing meaning kingship, and priesthood meaning priesthood, there requires a different order. In conclusion, a new order is required. Not a new Elohim, not a new covenant, but a higher administration. There is a new covenant, but we're talking about administration and order. That's why understanding Melchizedek matters, because Melchizedek is king and priest and administrator. And Melchizedek appears before Levi. He receives tithes from Abraham. He blesses Abraham. He has no tribal genealogy. Yahusha came from Judah, but he presides over the entire house. And those of the other nations grafted into the house, this brings other believers into the picture without replacement theology. 1 Peter 2 verse 9 calls us a royal priesthood. Royal means kingship, priesthood means Melchizedek, and the inheritance is a birthright restored in Messiah. This is why the firstborn has to be born from above. It's not about being born again. You have to be born from above. And believers of other nations grafted in, they do not replace Israel or steal Judah's throne. They are grafted into Messiah's administration. And this is foreshadowed through the adoption of Ephraim, which we'll discuss next time. So nothing is erased. Nothing is redefined. Everything is fulfilled. And this kind of sheds a whole new light and gives a whole nother meaning to the term. I did not come to abolish the Torah. I came to fulfill it. This doesn't mean that fulfillment is necessarily just about keeping commandments perfectly. It's about understanding the shadows of exactly what he fulfills. It's deeper than just commandments, because we are called to live in that fulfillment, right? This is how we make sense of covenant and promises and priesthood, in which all these things are administered through now. This is why it was important to go through the birthright and the blessing so that we can have a little bit better understanding of promises and inheritance in Messiah, because he fulfills both the birthright and the blessing. And they remain distinct, but he administers them both through the Melchizedek priesthood and order. In order to understand the function and administration of the Melchizedek order, We have to understand the prophecy of the birthright and the blessing. And this begins in Genesis. This is why understanding the shadows in Torah are so important, because if we don't live in the substance of what these shadows pointed to, then we essentially could still be living in the shadows, which can lead to, error, misunderstanding scripture. So, and this is why this is so important. So, birthright answers the question of who receives the inheritance. The answer is Messiah and those in Messiah. Blessing answers the question of who carries covenant authority. Our Messiah. Priesthood answers who will serve. The first question is, what priestly order are we serving in, which would be Melchizedek. So who will serve in that Melchizedek priesthood? And Messiah lawfully and rightfully fulfills all of these things without redefining any of them. It's not changing who this belongs to. It's revealing what they always pointed toward. The birthright and the blessing are just two of many examples of the shadows of Messiah's administration revealed in the Torah and fulfilled through him. Well, revealed through him, but foreshadowed in the Torah. It's a beautiful truth. And it's one of those, you kind of, as I look back on preparing this episode, I'm like, man, that really is pretty simple, isn't it? But it just kind of blows my mind that this is something that is just never talked about. And I really think that a lot of it has to do with misunderstanding covenant, because, all you hear is, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. But for some reason, the way people explain that sure sounds like abolishing. So I hope that this has brought more clarity to, seeing Messiah in the scriptures, and that this is edifying to your faith. This is why all believers, no matter whether you are one of the 12 tribes or not, this is why all believers are able to receive the inheritance, because the birthright belongs to Messiah, to be in covenant with the Most High, right? Because Messiah carries the covenant authority and kingship. This is why we are able to serve and operate as priests, because the Melchizedek order is administered through Messiah. And if we don't read the Old Testament with this revelation, then, beloved, you are still living in the shadows. And this is the issue. This isn't to condemn anybody, but this is the issue with the church today, because these are things that, because we don't have a proper understanding of covenant reality, we don't understand. It's like these things are just, they're misunderstood, so they're really just disregarded. These are things that have been disregarded for so long in understanding the gospel of our Messiah. And my hope and prayer is that through this study, as we continue to go through this season of wrestling through the scriptures to have better clarity on who our Messiah is and what he truly did, how this pointed to him, is that you and I both are able to step more fully out of these shadows and live in the fullness of the substance and reality, so that you can understand what it looks like to walk in covenant with the Most High and walk in the reality and beauty and light of what it means to have our Father's Torah, his commandments, written on our heart, and doing that so that you can help others do the same. So to Yah be the glory, and until next time, Yah bless.